Kia ora. Excellent. Uh, it's always the technology which is the hardest part of these things, making sure it's working.
Yeah.
Professor, doctor, what's your honorific?
Jedi? No, associate. Associate Professor.
Yeah, I'm joined today with Associate Professor Khylee Quince from Auckland University of Technology, and you are. What's your area? How would you describe you? You do it.
So my professional life, criminal justice advocate. So I teach and research in criminal law, youth justice, so including incarceration, particular focus on Maori, of course, so Maori engagement in criminal justice and imprisonment, and all of the issues around that. So including family law, so whānau, so that whole pipeline, from care and protection, welfare issues through, and then graduation, if you like, into adult offending and imprisonment. And what happens to people when they're spat out by the pipeline, if they ever are, rather than going round and round. So yeah, basically those kinds of issues, the life pathways of people involved in criminal justice.
Oh my God, we have so much to talk about. I love that you call it a pipeline, because I guess I look at the world in a sociological way, right? I try my very best to not blame an individual necessarily for the actions which they have, not blame. I understand that individual actions come from a whole system and a whole environment that has shaped their life path and put them on a particular pipeline one way or the other. And you see in our, so often we only ever focus on the action of the individual and ignore all the things to that individual doing whatever it is that they've done, right? And I think that's increasingly true over the last 40 years since the advent of like a neoliberal ideology. Is that fair to say?
Undoubtedly. So I'd say probably if I was to, in a nutshell, describe the core of my work, both my academic work and my work in the community. So I'm a report writer for offenders, so mainly in prison. So sometimes people who have been remanded at large in the community, but it's always people who are coming up for sentence in criminal courts. And that's probably the nugget of what I do, is explain criminal law is so overly focused on, as you've said, the individual person, what that individual person did at one moment in time in their life. And it's not really particularly interested in the backstory, but it's also not really interested in the future story either. So I see my job as doing both of those things, explaining, basically, I'm a Doctor Who fan, so it's like the time-space continuum, so it's like where they come from, who are they connected to, what is not just their own actual whakapapa, so their actual genealogy, but the genealogy of what you sociologists would call like their attitudes and behaviour, the social learning that they've had from their whānau, not only the learning that they have had, but the learning that they missed out on, I mean, because we always say really flippant things like, oh, everybody knows the difference between right and wrong. Well, actually, no, they don't. No, they don't. So a lot of it's explaining that, but it's very much about untangling, moving away from the individual person. And actually, those individual people, they've also drunk the Kool-Aid on individual responsibility, from neoliberal offending. Like one of the most common kōrero, and I had this conversation with an inmate this morning in prison, and they've also drunk the Kool-Aid. Like they think, oh no, I'm a bad person. I did this terrible thing. And one of the most common phrases I hear when I want to unpack, where did you get this attitude, the attitude you have towards women, or the attitudes you have around violence and your experiences around violence, where do they come from? And almost invariably, people will describe very long histories of victimization as well as offending. They will, but then they'll describe and say, oh no, I'm the black sheep in my family. I'm the individual wrongdoer. I did these terrible things. And then when I ask them, do you have other whānau members who've been to prison or who've had the same kind of offending histories? And of course, they'll describe fathers, uncles, cousins, brothers, who are also often there with them. And I'll say that's a lot of black sheep. You're not black sheep. This is differential group learning and inherited attitudes and behaviours. And as you mentioned, it is hard to try and that doesn't excuse people's individual agency. It doesn't excuse what they've done, but it certainly explains it. It no doubt explains it. And those people also don't want to be excused. I think that's another sort of really strongly held myth in society, that people think that people want to get away with things. Actually, they don't. In my experience, people be held responsible for what they've done, but they do also want to tell their story about how they came to be that person, who did these terrible things, but who's also someone that's had terrible things done to them. So that was a bit of a long-winded answer, but that's very much so. I think the core of the work I do is explaining context. So I think I'm a big picture person. Look to, people get really scared in New Zealand about words like colonisation, and that words like how can Hone, who robbed the dairy in Manurewa last Wednesday, where does colonisation fit there? It does, and that's my job, to like draw the links between that kid who probably knows nothing about their own personal or tribal history, and they would never use the words that we might use to describe them, but they know it. They inherently know it. They know, that these other things have happened that require explaining.
So this is where it gets really difficult, because the legal system under which we all operate and which individuals navigate through their life path is shaped by public opinion. Politicians make the laws depending on what we're screaming about in the streets, or in these days on Twitter or on Facebook or Instagram, right? And so I believe that the difficult work in creating a more just, equitable justice system, and indeed society, is around convincing that, not even convincing, but helping show our populace exactly what you're talking about. And that's not to excuse criminal behavior or ensure that people aren't held accountable for the crimes that they do commit. Like I work in sexual violence prevention and family violence prevention. I've been a victim of crime. I grew up with family violence. I want people held accountable for what they do, but I want them to be held accountable in a way that ensures that they won't perpetuate the cycle of which they are a victim. So, exactly. So how do we, or how do you and I, or how does anyone watching this have a kind conversation with someone who might be like, lock them up, throw them away the key, they're a bad person? Because I think that's where the tricky part lies in this hyper polarized, hyper mediated time. How do we help others understand that this isn't an aberrant individual? This is someone who's had like a cultural, historical transmission of suffering and trauma and never been taught right from wrong, as you say, Khylee. How do we have that conversation?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So for one, it's, labels are really harmful. And one of those labels are labeling people, offenders and victims. So one is to tell a story of, so moving away from the victim-offender dichotomy is really important to allow people to be vulnerable enough to tell you their, again, it's not inevitable that someone who is an offender is a perpetrator has been a victim, but overwhelmingly so they are. And so one thing to do is to share the stories. I think New Zealanders, on the one hand, we are quite, we're really quite a punitive society in many ways. But we're also good people in the sense that when we hear actual stories, so storytelling is so important to that. So when we hear, although you might have an attitude born of ignorance, and I mean ignorance in its true sense, not ignorance in meaning that someone is stupid, but just that they literally do not know. So one is storytelling to share someone's background, which is very difficult for. Again, I think people seem to have an idea that offenders might make stuff up about what's happened to them. No one's going to tell Tika about about victimization. That's a really, really and you would know it's you feel incredibly privileged when someone opens up about their histories of harm, and so sharing that. So I try to make sure. So the information that I get is usually for a judge, and I'm a privileged person. None of this ever happened to me. I grew up in a fantastic family, a completely functional family. And one of the things I say whenever I'm talking to these people, I've never been hit in the face in my life. I've never been hit in my life, And I don't know, people kind of think that that's unusual. They certainly do. In Maori families, they think that's unusual, and what a terrible thing to have to own as a privilege, that you haven't been harmed by people that are supposed to love you and do love you in some way. So. And so it's to explain to people that are like me, many people, the decision makers are people that tend not to come from, the kinds of backgrounds where these things are completely normative. They're totally normal, common behaviours, and even having to say it out loud is kind of interesting. It's not interesting. It's terrible. It's terrible that you have to say those things. So I end up, I think, in the storytelling. So I've done this mahi this is my 4th year of doing that job. And I've really learned about what other people don't know about people who come from offending backgrounds, and the things that they don't know that I find judges find helpful or unusual are things like poverty and actually explaining exactly what that means. Today I visited a family that doesn't have a back door. Today I visited a family that didn't have a toilet, or and where people were hungry. So really getting to the absolute nitty gritty of circumstances in which people have made the decision to go and rob the dairy, or things like, for example, I got a summary of facts about an offender, and they're not very specific. So it was a young man who robbed a dairy in Pukekohe, and the judge can't see what it is that they took. But when I met him and I spoke with his family, I got to write down he went to the dairy to steal 2-minute noodles and toothpaste and soap for his little brothers and sisters. And sharing that kind of, it just changes the game, so being really specific and getting right down to the nitty gritty of, these are the decisions that people have had to make, choosing, to break the law so that they can feed their families. And telling a big part.
Yeah, you're saying that the power in shifting community ideas actually comes from an empathy exercise, essentially.
Absolutely.
What would you do in that situation if you didn't have a back door and your little sister was hungry? You might break the law, right?
Yeah.
Yeah,
and I think that New Zealanders are actually they're empathetic when they can put themselves in other people's shoes when they're given all of the information about this is the context in which they were when they made that decision. Can you understand that? Not would you do it, but can you understand that?
Yeah, this is interesting because I feel so many people don't take context into any consideration at all. So this ties in, I guess, to what we're seeing across our social media feeds, like massively, which is the unrest in the United States of America after the extrajudicial killing of George Floyd by Derek Chauvin, the police officer, and his 3 colleagues. And so many people are now... The biggest example of this for me was the African-American conservative commentator Candace Owens this morning put a Periscope, it's like a video up, running through the criminal history of George Floyd, some of which was quite horrific. One in particular, mostly like cocaine offenses. And one was an armed robbery of a pregnant woman with some accomplices. Reprehensible behavior, but at the same time, no talk of context. If you have multiple cocaine offenses, chances are you have an alcohol and drug problem, right? And a mental health history. And nowhere does in her diatribe today, which was very ideological, was there talk of, well, he did get offered alcohol and drug treatment, counseling, what's his lived history of trauma, what are the epigenetic factors which have led to his substance abuse, which I would imagine has led to his offending.
Yeah.
and there are millions of people out there, I know, like literally she has millions of followers who are sharing this video here in New Zealand too,
Yeah.
watching video like this and saying, yeah, good point, good point, good point. Like, how do you help those people reflect that what they're consuming, like from a talking head who's so influential, isn't like the truth?
I'm speechless. That is just outrageous.
It was yeah. I was really worked up about it, but I mean, I'm an emotional dude. Like,
and again, it comes what victim blaming is so.
That's what I called it too. But
it is victim blaming. It's right. Those things. His history is not tattooed on his forehead. He doesn't wear a T-shirt that has his history written on it. This is not, that's just an attempt to, it's just an attempt at deflection, and it's really quite irrelevant.
It muddies the waters, right? Like
absolutely.
Because for me, it struck me as, in a way, it's a defense of killing someone like that because they're not worth as much as someone who doesn't commit crime or hasn't had a drug problem, right? Is that fair to say?
Oh, undoubtedly, and in New Zealand we see some of those attitudes in relation to violence against women and intimate partnerships.
Yeah,
the whole attitude about management of your partner's violence, compared with our attitudes towards stranger violence. So very much so we see that reflected. Although interestingly, when it comes to the nitty gritty of, say, in a courtroom context, we're much better, because you get to hear more of the context rather than just the headline, But you can definitely see parallels in that victim blaming in the context of family violence and intimate partner violence in New Zealand. Why didn't you leave? What was the or the language around mutual relationships of mutual violence, etc. And again, all deflection from perpetrator behaviour, and it's crap.
That is interesting, talking about mutual violence. Do you want to speak to that a little bit? Because I was in a conversation with actually a former friend of mine, and I reached out to him because I knew that he'd assaulted a woman in his life, and I wanted to have a direct conversation. It would be fake of me to post all this stuff on Facebook and be aware of that and not challenge him on that behavior. And first it was like, who's talking fucking shit about me? And then it was like, actually, bro, yeah, like I did this and this. And there's a time in my life where I would have excluded a man like that for that behavior. But now that I've worked with offenders and have all this understanding of a broader context, I was like, well, here are some options for change for you. But he's still in that deflection mode and that, well, she hit me first and she did this and that happened and yada, yada, yada. What do you say to people when they talk about mutual violence?
Yeah, it was increased. It was very common. It is a common phrase or turn of phrase that people talk about. Or they use phrases like toxic relationship, all of these things that really deflect from the primary perpetrator or the primary wrongdoer in a relationship. So if we look at, when we're talking about when people are talking about mutual violence, they are like your friend saying, that there was wrongful behaviour by the other party. But a couple of things I'd say about that. One is that fatal violence is almost always, fatal or serious violence is almost always perpetrated by male on female in this country as every other Western country. And often, and I've had to work with judges sometimes on unpacking using phrases or terminology such as mutual violence or the idea of toxic relationships, is also to look at the nature of the violence. So, of course, in large part, women are unable to take on the strength of men in their relationships. If you're talking about a heteronormative relationship. Which means that the violence by women is hardly ever directed at the physical person of the man. So the violence will be violence to his property. It will be keying his car. It will be chopping up his clothes. It'll be burning shit. But you will hardly ever see a female without a weapon taking on the physical person of a male partner. Because she will lose in that fight. So, but even when that happens, so a woman will be charged with willful damage or criminal damage of property, and still you might see in the legal context, discussion of a toxic or relationship of mutual violence, which I would say is true to the extent that there was wrongful behaviour on both sides, but it certainly is not mutual in the sense of being equal partners or even wrongdoers that are able to commit the same form of harm on one another. So as I said, so really serious or fatal violence is almost inevitably male and female. And when I did interviews for my master's thesis way back in 2000, it was about Māori women in prison, and fully 1/3 of all Māori women in prison at that time were there for homicide, and all of them for taking lethal self-help against their male partner.
Wow, so the
entire system, so self-defense. But self-defense that doesn't work in New Zealand because our self-defense, the way that we've constructed self-defense is a requirement that you do take on, a man at the time that he is so preemptive violence is, just doesn't, you get nowhere in that in New Zealand. So they're almost always women that attack when someone is disinhibited, they're asleep, or they're intoxicated. So they are physically weakened in some way, because otherwise they would never win that contest. So similar to what I said about Māori, telling the story of Māori offenders, that's also a work in progress, and one that we're not making a huge amount of headway on, in my view, is how we deal with intimate partner violence and female victimization within intimate partnerships in New Zealand. We are a long way behind most of the rest of the Western world in our attitudes to women in those kinds of relationships, in the way that we respond to them when they do take lethal self-help and kill a perpetrator. We're not good at that. And again, it's part of that taking into account the long-term context of their relationship.
And that is such a, I guess a lot of people would say, well, she still murdered him, without reflecting on the really real and deep psychological wounds that happen after a lifetime of being in an abusive relationship. Even if that abusive relationship isn't one where you're beat up every day, it's still deeply wounding, right? When we're thinking about emotional control and financial control and the wheel of power control and the Duluth model, and oh my God. So
I think we are making moves towards the idea, as you've just mentioned, of thinking about coercive control rather than just physical violence. And actually, there are far more relationships that are characterized by coercive control, which is where one partner takes control over the other in terms of the finances, in terms of how they look, who they associate with. So without, as you say, that's about psychological control rather than physical control. And that is almost as damaging as and some people, victims sometimes say that is more difficult to break from than the ability to manage even physical harm.
Bruises heal far quicker than that deep-seated subconscious damage that words and actions and manipulative behavior and gaslighting, right? Like,
absolutely.
I'm curious to know though, like, how do you prove that harm in a court of law? That's the difficult part. Because if I get my face punched in, I can take a photograph and put it on my cell phone and go to the cops. But if I'm too scared to leave my house because I'm going to get 100 text messages and I'm going to come home and I'm going to get the cold shoulder and I'm going to get the kids threatened to be taken off me, and like how do we show that in a court of law? And also just an add on that. Sorry. How do you help a jury understand that?
Yeah, the second question is even harder than the first. So let's start with the idea of proof and evidence, which is difficult. So I started by saying that criminal law tends to be focused on an individual person that did a particular thing. So as you say, if you're talking about assault, that means, is there evidence, as you say, that there was an assault, an injury that happened at a particular time on a particular day? It's much more difficult to, in criminal law, to talk about a relationship. So so criminal law is very much focused on particular periods of time. What happened on X day? Relationships aren't like that. You're not going to remember, that, or have proof about what happened in 10 years ago when you started a relationship. What you can do, and so one of the issues with this is in relation to a person that maybe the victim of that kind of coercive control type relationship is, and this is problematic in my view, and that is the pathologizing of this as being something that she needs to explain or manage. So in other words, one of the ways that that's done in criminal law is that she will be subject to a psychological and psychiatric assessment, right? So this is about, which is interesting because again, that's a form of deflection from the actual wrongdoer, the person that has done the controlling. I had a client in the last week who was subject to an 18-year relationship of coercive control, very little physical violence. In 18 years, we're talking about fewer than 3 or 4 actual physical assaults, but a very strong relationship of control in relation to how she looked, who she could be with. And so the evidence that was called, other than her interviews with a psychologist, were around things like being able to show that she hadn't had a bank account in 20 years. She wasn't allowed to have a bank account. To show records from her employer that showed that her wages were direct credited into the partner's account to which she had no access. And also evidence, of course, as you'll know, one of the sort of core characteristics or defining characteristics of these kinds of relationships is isolation. So evidence from her children to say she wasn't allowed to call us, she wasn't allowed to be around family members, for them to literally be able to produce, photos of here's Christmas without her, here's our birthdays without her. So I do have an issue with the pathologizing of the behaviour by looking at the mindset of the woman who stayed, whereas that is still a deflection from the actual wrongdoer, who's the other party.
And when it comes to convincing a jury, I guess that role in shifting those understandings is that outreach work. It's that ongoing conversation that we have to have for years and years and years.
Yeah.
To broaden,
to talk about, access to finances, access to friendships, so it is the painting of the picture to say this is the sort of life she had to live in this relationship being controlled by this person, an inability to have any social life at all or any public life really. And so again, it's explaining, it's painting a picture of a life that's in probably quite strong contrast to the lives that most jurors or judges have.
I know. I literally was given a presentation to, I think, like a collection of lawyers and legal professionals once, and I was talking about what we would call a rape culture, or a culture which transmits ideas which normalize sexual violence. And an older woman stood up and said, well, I hear what you're saying, but these young women do give the wrong idea going out there. This was a few years ago, with their low-cut tops and having a few drinks, and it really highlighted to me that if someone in the legal profession would ask me that question in a room full of her peers, not mine, we got a long way to go.
Absolutely. And I've gotten myself into similar situations, and they are my colleagues, and it is, in some ways, that's much harder, isn't it? So, I mean, being an outsider, talking to people who aren't your peers or colleagues in that professional sense, that's interesting for them to hear an outsider perspective. As an insider, it's often harder even to say, look, you guys are doing this all wrong. I had an opportunity, I did that last year, and I was completely ostracized, was probably a nice way of putting it, by senior members of the criminal bar for calling out their rape culture, calling out their manner of cross-examination, teaching old dogs new tricks is really hard work. You don't make friends doing it. And like you were talking about trying to call out your friend in relation to his behaviour. I don't know. People think that you're brave or courageous in doing so. You have an obligation to call out.
I appreciate you saying. I appreciate you saying that, because sometimes I look at all the discord and the fucking constant noise on social media all the time, and I'm like, what's the point of this? Like, what are we doing here? Like, we're moving further and further away from each other, and it's actually, you see family members falling out, and you lose friends. But there is actually an important benefit in well-constructed statements online, or gentle questioning and challenging of people's status quo, enforcing ideas, right? Like, if it's important to shift the ideas of professionals and jurors and lay people for political outcomes, it is important to have those conversations so they don't perpetuate the culture which this violence and this victim blaming comes from. But I guess I
kind of see it as a challenge. I'm pretty obsessed with social media. I love it. I love it, and then I hate it. But
me too, sis. Me too. Oh my God.
I can't help. I've never done. I've seen you and other people kind of tap out for little bits of time. I've never done that yet. But it can be challenging, and I get myself in trouble all the time. But on the daily, I think I really do use it as I don't mean a bloody big note myself or anything, but I do see it as a challenge. If I again, without pumping up my own tires, but I think what I'm best at is communicating, and it's a real challenge to communicate in different platforms things that are really important to you. And, of course, I think that people should be able to have a diverse range of opinions, but of course I back my own, because I think it's right. As I often say to my students, I'd agree with you, but then we'd both be wrong.
Yeah. I see, this is an interesting thing, right? Like, because the people I've actually fallen foul of on social media are people who I actually have more ideologically in common with. Like, I've been called out for, I don't know, once I put a post up some months ago about how racism sucks, and a young person of color, clearly younger than me, attacked me on it for saying, well, it's not really your space to talk about it, you're a white guy. And I'm like, well, actually, I'm mixed race. Like, my family's from Lebanon, and like, I couldn't go on a whites-only dating site if you were tracing my heritage back. That's a thing. Do you know that's an actual thing? There are like racial dating sites. Like, if you were tracing my genealogy back, I couldn't go out with an Aryan princess, like. But that's the sort of thing. Or like, a lot of my work is around sexual violence prevention and looking at gendered issues. And as a man talking about concepts which have a deep feminist ideological underpinning, it can be really, really tricky, because feminism has got so much intra-feminist discourse and disagreement within it. It's not a cohesive set of ideas. Some people have like very different ideas when it comes to sexual liberation versus sexual exploitation, and like, so how do we temper our concept of call-out culture, I guess, is what I'm asking you. Because if I wasn't like you, and so, because sometimes it makes me want to stop. Sometimes it makes me want to go, like, because it messes up my mental health, and it takes me away from my real world and being a good boyfriend and like, it keeps me up at night. Like, I lose sleep over it, because I'm like, did I do wrong? Or did I just have a different opinion? Or did I just be a human being and clumsily say something do you know what I mean? Because I really worry that social justice culture, which I want the same outcomes, but the way that I see it working seems to like push moderate people away, and I worry about that.
Yeah. I think about that all the time, and I actually think, again, because the core paid gig is tertiary teaching, right? And so I'm a law teacher. There are 10 Maori legal academics in the entire country.
Wow.
I've been doing the job for longer than all of them. And so you're used to being the only Maori in the building. You're used to being, And so you're used to talking to people that aren't like you. So as long as you have a good, and for years that was really difficult. It was really difficult being there because you feel like in this. So the connection I'm trying to make here is to say, I was constantly questioning myself, high anxiety about representing my people. Like as if any one person could, I'm not an ill speaker, I'm born and raised, I'm an urban Maori, as I've said, I've never been subject to violence. I have a loving family. I've clearly never missed a meal in my life. No, if there was a deprivation index, I'm like ding ding at the top of the, urban middle class Maori privilege spectrum. But I'm comfortable with that. And when you get older, you become less. I see my kids wouldn't do it, but I do see some kids almost trying to, not like be as ghetto as they can, but being embarrassed about. One thing I really rally against is. So my advice is you do not have to suffer the harm or be in the group to be a good friend and a good ally. You do, so I don't get this, stay in your lane, but, we're talking about pretty basic bottom lines. You're not speaking for people, but you can speak with them and alongside them. And I think, I fucking hate that, the people that are assholes to their allies. I hate it.
Oh, mean. This makes me feel real good. You're making me feel good about myself.
It's hard enough. Who wants to row that boat by themselves? This is as I said, I've been in a workplace where I've been the only Māori for years, for decades.
Yeah.
And so you have to learn your bottom line. You have to learn how to get on with other people. Sometimes I describe myself as a Pākehā whisperer, let me stroke your fragility, give me what I want,
I love that. A Pākehā whisperer. That's sick. Well, this is the thing. I think a lot of this online activism is there is a generational difference in how we talk to one another. And I think that's the thing. Like, I've been involved in one form or another in wanting the world to be different and better for people who are unfortunate. Since I was a teenage boy listening to punk rock music and Public Enemy and like my music is what politicized me on top of my childhood, right? In which, and then I decided to 26, it's like, I should probably get some proper qualifications. And then I went to university and got like a form, you know what I mean? Like, but I've always been around, as you were saying, people who are different to me. I do have friends who vote for the National Party. I have friends who are fucking patch gang members. I have friends who are politicians, even if they don't text me back anymore because it'll get them in trouble. Like I've got friends who are drug dealers. I've got friends who are drug addicts, and I think that has taught me.
In New Zealand, 1 degree.
I know, 1 degree separation, right? And it's, I think that's the thing is that I don't hang out in a bubble, whether virtually or in real life, but a lot of people do. And how do you help those people? I guess I say this all the time. Not let the perfect be the enemy of good. Like how do we help people meet in the middle somewhere, right? What's your advice to that? How do you help people think?
This is part of my Pākehā whispering work.
Do some whispering.
And partly it's to make things. I don't think it's pandering to people, but to make things easy by opening up people's experience. So, for example, one example that comes to mind, I taught a criminal justice course at University of Auckland, and one of the things I wanted to do, to have practical experience of being advocates, right? These are kids who are interested in being criminal advocates or family lawyers. So for their assessment, I wanted them to go and work with Auckland Action Against Poverty on the day where they sort of advocate with beneficiaries. And so when I nominated, go to Māngere Town Centre, let's hang out at Wynn's, and we'll set up a table and you take people's instructions and then we'll go in with them to talk about benefit entitlements, and you be there to help them through the process. And everyone thought it was a really cool idea. And then this handful of Pākehā students sort of lined up after class, and they were all quite embarrassed. And when we got to the end of it, they said, "Where's Māngere Town Centre? This is like 15 minutes from our classroom. Never been there, you know. And I'm like, okay, like, you know, and I wouldn't shame someone for that, but that was quite an eye opener to me, and I'm like, fuck, really? And so it was like, you know, a joint class trip where, you know, where I could drive them to Mangere to, you know, go to Browntown for
yeah. So it's about actually,
you know, it's opening people up to other experiences, you know.
Yeah. And that doesn't always happen on the internet, right? Like the internet's not always the best place for that.
No, it's not. And it's difficult to gauge. I'm quite new to Twitter. I've only been on Twitter for a couple of months, and
be careful.
I still haven't quite gauged people's authenticity. You know, whether people are genuine or not, and you know, it's difficult to assess that. I don't know if that will last actually.
I've in my experience, I mean, I've always had an interest, like you, in like online culture. Like I used to write on message boards long before social media was a thing. Like whether it's about punk rock or kickboxing, and then as I've evolved as a human being, like about politics and ideas. And for me, like Twitter is the most unhealthy of the social media platforms. And it's very tribal, and there's an in-group and an out-group, and there's no real room for nuance and gray areas and the complicated nature of being a human being, where we often hold like paradoxical ideas in and of ourselves. And I think that's partly because of the limited character count. I think that's partly because often if you get retweeted or someone this is the thing, like people screenshot what you said as proof that somehow you're like a bad person or a good person. It divorces you from the context of who you are and what you otherwise do. Like if you and me were saying something and then you said something that upset me, I understand to a degree your backstory.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, in this moment, I might not agree with that and it might upset me, but she's not a bad person and I'm not going to cancel her and remove her from my life. Whereas in Twitter, people lose their fucking careers over something they said that was a joke that was taken out of context. Like, sure, some shit that people say is horrific. Like, it's bad and, like, they deserve to be held to account for it. But sometimes I'm like, that was just a distasteful joke. Do they deserve to have their whole life ruined? I don't think so.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I also like to go back to the beginning of what you were saying there. Again, in New Zealand, despite the fact we're so small and we do have such a wide variety of relationships and experiences, different, sometimes we're not that. We still expect people to primarily patch to one tribe. You know?
I like that you said patch. That was good.
Yeah, like we do. You know, like, so I was the only Māori, you know, my partner and I, we've been together since we were 14 at high school, and we were the only two punk rockers at school. But which meant but people couldn't kind of get that I would be Māori, clever, you know, I was a nerdy kid, and like the school punk rocker, and they were like, you can't be all of those things, you know, you got to be.
I totally get that. Yeah, because I'm covered in tattoos. I made a name for myself as a really good Muay Thai fighter and kickboxer, and I'm in this hyper masculine space and continue to be, and I love it. I like really aggressive music and metal and jumping off stages and all this shit. But I work in like transforming masculinity, and feminist ideology and feminist leadership in New Zealand has led me to the space that I'm in, and I want to break down those old constructs, which are constructs which have actually advantaged me. You know, like the reason I have a following and a degree of a platform is because basically I used to be good at fucking kicking people in the face. You know what I mean? And that's why I get a buy-in. Like I get a bro pass, I think, to some degree with dudes. And if I wore a cardigan, I don't know if that would work so well, right? But people don't know how to pigeonhole you. I mean, people want to pigeonhole you. Yeah, it's the same as you. I'm really enjoying that you have that parallel. I love
sci-fi. I love pop culture. So it gives you a different way. You know, one of your big questions is how can you connect to other people, particularly when you've got quite serious kaupapa to talk about, right? Like violence and offending.
I
So
know.
what part of the thing is being, I think New Zealanders are good at being self-deprecating and at being funny. But, so one of my kind of opening lines, I used to really, when I started doing the offender interviews with young Maori boys, and I used to kind of think, why the fuck would they talk to me? Like, I don't, I look Pākehā, I'm clearly middle class, and they would be thinking, why would they talk to this lady, And so, I found the magic ingredients. Being Māori is obviously a connection with them. Being a mum is really, really important. There's people respect you for that. Being a parent generally is a magic ticket to like so much of the universe, it forces you to think differently, but it also forces other people to think about you differently when they know that you're a parent. But one of the things I quite often say to these boys, when they will tell me something terrible, about past trauma, and I'll say, well, I haven't been punched in the face or subject to violence by a member of my family, but I have experienced trauma. I'm a day one Warriors fan, this has been like nearly 30 years of my life, And
they crack up.
Yeah.
Hey, let's talk about New Zealand's Pacific, and then I'd like to maybe touch on the American context, given that's dominating our headlines at the moment. Let's talk about colonialism, and let's talk about epigenetic trauma. I'm really interested to know, from your professional and academic understanding, like, can we speak to that? Because like I said, man, I know a bunch of guys have been in and out of jail and they had hard lives, and then if we think about the start of this conversation, they are still blamed for what they've done. How does having your language taken off you, how does having your land taken off you, how does your grandparents getting hit for speaking te reo Māori in school just in the 1950s, how does that impact a young man or a young woman today?
A big question. I thought, and I don't know that we've done very well in not leaving that. I was going to say in leaving that to the social scientists, because social scientists, have been trying to explain those things to decision makers. So judges, social workers, teachers, for example, have been trying to explain what the impact of collective and intergenerational trauma is to children and young people and the lives that they end up living, the attitudes they have. People have been trying to do that for generations. We've got to remember that, the last native school closed in 1967. That's like 5 years before I was born. That's amazing. So, it's you can almost touch those experiences, but you can touch the people like the children who went to those schools. You can it's just obvious evidence, the damage of the internalization of colonization, the lateral violence that our men and women do commit upon each other, upon their children, the violence they perpetuate on their physical selves in terms of addictions. You can draw the whakapapa of that colonial legacy to almost every aspect of deprivation and, negative experience of contemporary Māori life back to that, to not having, so it's I like to start from, rather than from, I think one of the keys is not starting from deficit about what people people's current experience, but to start from the, sort of Māori normative healthiness. What does that look like, And if you boil it down, it's whānau, it's whenua, and it's whakapapa. So knowing who you are, where you're from, who you owe obligations to, and who owes obligations to look after you. If you don't have those three building blocks in your life, then it's very difficult to be healthy and functioning. And I think for Indigenous peoples, there's also one of the, when I've been thinking about what resonance does the Black Lives Matter have to Aotearoa, there's a point of difference for Indigenous peoples. And so one of the things that I've been concerned about over the past, not just the past week, but is the invisibility of the Red Lives Matter movement. So
sure. As in Native American people.
Yeah. The differences, and again, I found this from dealing with Pacifica young people and Maori young people. When these things happen on your own whenua, on your own territory that you no longer own, that you're a citizen of it, but you have less access to it than you did. You don't speak your own language on your own territory. It's an additional layer of trauma to, say, being the migrant experience or the minority experience of African Americans, for example. That's problematic. And I think that's really part of the injury. The injury of colonization is when these things happen to you on your own territory. It's not to say it's any worse. It's just to say it's different. It's a different, I do think it's a different psychological impact on your well-being when this has happened, when you haven't gone anywhere, you haven't been anywhere. And then part of that gaslighting becomes this fact that you don't belong. Well, of course we belong here. We were here first. And you raised epigenetics, which I think is one of the fascinating things, is that if we, again, and I've had judges and social workers and lawyers and other people diminish the authenticity or value of like a social science explanation of talking about people's qualitative experience about not having language, not having culture or territory. But when you cannot dismiss physical science, you cannot dismiss biological science. There is a project being undertaken by the Cherokee people around epigenetics, where they are mapping the brains, they're scanning the brains of their rangatahi, of their young people, and they can show you the effect of colonization on their physical, organic brain matter, that they are missing particular neural connections and pathways, and that is unbelievable. To say that trauma, and they also see it in the brains of the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, and to see what impact, and that's just amazing. And it's just another tool to or proof. I hate that lawyers are so fucking obsessed with proof, with evidence. What evidence do you have of this? Judges are always saying, what evidence do you have that colonial experience affected Hone that committed that robbery in Manurewa? I'm like, what more do you need? That he is from Tūhoe. Tūhoe had this happen to them, or he is from Tainui. Tainui had raupatu happen to them, or from Parihaka. How could that not be relevant? So it can be really frustrating, but I think, hard science is going to be one of the really, it's like it's a home run tool in some senses. You look at Taina Pora, for example. Yeah. Taina is clearly, he again is a product of that same history. And how does he get across the line in the end? Because of FASD. FASD, fetal alcohol spectrum disorder, and many of the cognitive disabilities or dysfunction that shows up as hard science, that is the result of harmful behaviour that is caused by colonization. FASD means that someone is drinking problematically in pregnancy. That's not cool, and that's not normal. But there's hard evidence there. Oh, he's got this, and it means he can't, and it's not just Taina, it's lots of people. But in a way that kind of annoyed me, that was the thing that gets you over the line, but, the really obvious stuff doesn't. But, it does take sort of multiple perspectives to help explain, trauma, really. Partly it will be whakapapa type evidence, verbal evidence, patterns of behaviour, commonly held attitudes, and disconnection.
Disconnection from our land, disconnection from our history, and disconnection from ourselves, right? I mean, I'm personalizing it, but I mean, that's what we're thinking about.
I had a client this morning who the name on all of her charge sheets for all of these offences and her actual birth name bore no resemblance to one another whatsoever. And no one had thought, and it was dead obvious to me. I sat down, I'm like, hey, tell me what's up with your name? You know, one was a completely Pākehā name, and she just made it up. And I'm like, what's this name? And she goes, oh, I've called myself that since I was a kid because I didn't feel like I had the right connection to the whakapapa of my name. And I'm like, that is terrible. You know, that is I mean, it's a small thing, but it's everything to her, you know, that she didn't even feel comfortable in her own name, you know, and it was a tūturu, genuine Tainui tribal name, and she didn't feel she had the mana to own it. And what a terrible. So we talked about that a lot. So what do you think it would take for you to re-own, to wear your own name again? And she said, oh, no one's ever asked that, you know, they would just think that, and I've come across this several times, and they just think it's an alias in the way that criminal people use an alias to avoid responsibility. And it's not that at all. It was just about identity, but identity in the psychic sense, not in the sense of trying to be someone that you're not, but saying, I don't feel like I belong in my own name. What a terrible indictment on our society that people have, you know, that they think that that's what they should do.
Do you think our society has shifted so much in the last 30 years since I was a boy, 40 years, that our Indigenous people, our Pacifica immigrant community, who still grew up with the Dawn Raids, and is making them feel more comfortable in their own skin? Do you think that there is a better representation of people of color and people of different cultural backgrounds and understandings of whānau and ainga, and that they feel less disconnected from themselves in our community? Or do you think that not really that much has changed, and that's why we have asymmetrical rates of incarceration, asymmetrical rates of substance abuse, suicide, and self-harm?
That's a good question. What immediately comes to mind is probably the seminal piece of research that has made the most difference to my professional life and understanding of Māori and offending is Māori in the Criminal Justice System by Moana Jackson in 1987. In 1987, Moana interviewed hundreds of Māori from around the country about offending, and so that was 30 years ago. And 30 years ago, that kōrero and all of the consultation that came back was all about disconnection from identity, that offenders are young people, so they were, you know, 2 generations after the war, 2 generations after urbanisation. So very strong message that offending was caused by disconnection from identity. Moana he's just completed his 30-year update, so it's another generation on.
Wow.
And so the offending statistics have gotten worse, but the explanation from the community and from the offenders themselves has changed. So, and I think this is really interesting. So it's much less about identity politics, and because if you think in the interim 30 years, we've had the growth of kohanga reo and kura kaupapa schooling. We've had, and similarly, you know, charter schools and other phenomena for Pacifica communities. So it's less about identity, but it's more about poverty. So much more commonly, and again, I see this with a lot of the young that I work with, is they are reo speakers. They know where they're from. They've been to kura kaupapa, or they're kohanga reo babies. So they have a strong cultural connection and identity, and Pacifica people too, but poverty. So inequality has become exponentially worse in that generation. So we've seen a shift from this being about disconnection, and so the positive side is we've made some good strides in terms of that connection kaupapa, but the other kind of politics, economic politics, and the post-Rogernomics New Zealand has fundamentally changed the way that we think about other people, has fundamentally changed our ideas of broader ideas of connection to community and responsibility for one another, New Zealand, the founding mythology of Aotearoa, of New Zealand as a nation state, is so strongly wedded to this idea of equality, to this idea of the classless society, and it's just not true. And to some extent, it was never true. It was never true for Maori. It was never true for people that, because with that comes a very strong preference for homogeneity. We want people to be the same. That's where tall poppy comes from, right? You don't want to stick your head out. You want to be really different from everybody else. So in other words, we'll treat you equally in the sense of formal equality so long as you behave like us. And so let's go back to the question about, have we changed much in recent years to open the door to people of colour, to Māori, Pacifica people and migrant peoples? Yes, we've opened the door, but we haven't done a lot to change what's behind the door. If I think about, the job that I do, the job that lots of people do, it's you can come and be a member of our club, but it's still the same club. We still do the same business, I have to go to your club and teach law in pretty much the same way as all my colleagues do, So that's what you mean by structural change, right? So, I think hopefully we've come a little bit past window dressing, tokenism in a lot of forms, but structural change, structural change to the police, structural change to, major institutions, education, health, housing, all of those things, they're still done in pretty much the same way.
Sure.
And those things need to change. I mean, I'll give another example of something this week for free. Was a compassionate consideration for an inmate to be released. So his wife was dying, and he wanted obviously to be with her, and he didn't meet the criteria. And so I had pretty top-level conversations with people in corrections around the criteria in their law and policy around what compassion looked like, because there is a provision for a person to be released to be with their family or to attend, and the wording literally is about attending a funeral. And so I was saying to them, you do understand that this is what you've enshrined here is the Pākehā view of death and dying, for the important thing is going to a service which will last for 2 hours on the day of the burial or cremation. But for us, we have a different view of death. Death is a process, like it's something that happens over a period of time, and it's really important that you get there to clear all, that our tikanga, our law is that you try and clear all your debts and you clear the decks before you go, and he needs to be there for that, because if you identify as like we do, if I don't clear my debt, that is inherited by my any conflict that I have with my children or my wider community, that will be inherited by them. It doesn't go away, and so he has an obligation to go and do that. And they found that quite that was news to them, that we have this different way of our conception of death was not provided for in this framework at all. And we come across that a lot, so that's about how do you dismantle, I, as much as possible, I like to try and stay away from the big words like racism and colonization, because that people get freaked fuck out when you say that, Yeah. So you like use specific examples, or you try, and there is nothing wrong with that language, but it does, people like tend to like shut down, So you try to, or when you say things like, and it sounds too big, like structure. I want to make structural change,
Yeah. I know, right? Because most people aren't university educated. Most people are just going to work, trying to get laid on the weekends or be a good parent and just live their life.
Yeah.
And they're not out there thinking, oh, I'm part of maintaining the architecture of structural racism every time I maybe.
Yes.
Yeah.
What am I doing to perpetuate the hegemony today?
I know. And I think that's fucking, okay, well, you're talking about Twitter. I think that's what people on Twitter, like at least in New Zealand political Twitter and New Zealand academic Twitter, lose sight of, is that, even when I'm like, what is your goal here in this statement?
Yeah.
Do you actually want to make change? Or do you want to be seen to know some very arcane knowledge? And I genuinely think about this. I think about, if you want to make society more equitable, if you want to create these social changes, which we've been discussing this last hour, you actually need to reach people in the middle somewhere.
You do.
And you actually need to help them come across, rather than, as you say, make them feel powerless, make them feel actually attacked, or make them feel like, no, that doesn't pertain to my life. I'm not racist. I'm not sexist. I'm not part of any of these things. How do you bridge that gap?
Being clear, breaking it down to really quite simple actions. Like, of course, and on my own couch, I'm saying to my partner all the time, look at that fuckwit and his virtue signaling. He's never done anything important in his life.
Do you really? Because I do that. I do that too.
All the time.
Yeah,
and I'm like, I've never seen you. I'm like, you go to the march on Sunday and you think, this is a city of like nearly 2 million people and there's 4,000 people. Where are the rest of you assholes? Because it looks like everybody else on social media is all, into it. And I don't think they stayed away because of COVID. I just think, we haven't, there's become, and maybe that is part of a sort of generational thing. I say this to my kids now because they're teenagers, but protest marches were the best times of our lives at university. We seem to spend every second day on a big march against Rick Richardson and, against Rogernomics and, being active. New Zealanders can be quite apathetic, and so that's not a good thing. It's kind of hard to believe, about how mobile, our parents were against the Springbok tour and the Land March and things. And then what happened? What happened that people became so sort of passive and.
Well, passive in the tangible sense. They're real busy with their thumbs on Facebook sometimes, but it's like, yo, you can't walk Queen Street, really?
Yeah.
Because this is where I get frustrated. I was talking to Tony Porter last week. Now, Tony Porter is an educator and activist around stopping gendered violence, men's violence against women in the United States. And he started a really huge movement called A Call to Men. And it's about addressing conflicts. We're having this big conversation. He's an older guy than me. I first saw him in a documentary 5 years ago, and I was like, yo, he's the man. Like, I was really, like, a bit fanboy talking to him. And he said, similar, I guess, to what you're at least alluding to, he said, I'm not going to take leadership from someone who's fresh out of university, even if they're more qualified than I am. Like, I've walked this walk. I've been in this kaupapa for 25 years. Like, is that true of your thought process too? Like,
totally. Yeah. I mean, often I try to, I wouldn't say hide academic qualifications because they do get you into places.
Yeah.
But yeah, I totally get, you need to have, you don't need to have lived experience of the particular kaupapa, but you certainly need, and this is the benefit of New Zealand. New Zealand is so small that you don't have to be stuck in an ivory tower. You don't have to be stuck behind a desk. You can do multiple things. You can like get in there and, test your beliefs. You can, actually do, physical things to, put actions into your, actually activate your beliefs. I like that about New Zealand. I think we're really fortunate. There's also an accessibility to power. So one thing I found, so recently, for example, I I consider one of my favourite New Zealanders, one of my hero New Zealanders, Andrew Beecroft. I absolutely love the man. Children's Commissioner, former Principal Youth Court Judge, an amazing leader in the youth justice space, which is one of my sort of primary areas of teaching and research. But he said something recently as Children's Commissioner that I fundamentally disagreed with. And he just did it by a press release, and so I just typed up a little post for Facebook. Oh, it was respectful, but I'm like, oh bro, I love you, but this is nah. But obviously, and we're not Facebook friends because he can't be on Facebook because he's the Children's Commissioner. But literally within 20 minutes he rings me up and he's like, what's wrong, what did I do? And I'm like, bloody hell, did you have the spies on my feet? Like, what's going on? So there's an accessibility, and it ended up, of course I was respectful, I wasn't rude about it, but I was saying, I don't agree with you here. He rings me up. He didn't take offence at all, but, we had this conversation, and he goes, okay, I'm going to write an op-ed about this, and can I send it to you, and you give me some feedback? And, that's quite amazing about New Zealand, that you can.
I'm real bummed.
You can have direct contact
with people in power. Yeah, I'm quite sad after the whole, I don't know if you caught the whole thing, like I text Jacinda Ardern one time about a mutual friend, or like not a mutual friend, a friend of mine that a friend of mine had texted me about, and I wasn't thinking, I'm pretty naive to be honest, and now like none of my friends who work in politics ever text me back. It's like it bums me out because like they're good people and I like them, but it's politically risky, I suppose, to be in direct contact with me. So I'm just like, oh yeah, right. I guess you don't want to come on the podcast if you don't text me back. You know what I mean? That's the funny thing about living in a small country. Yeah. Do you know what I mean though? Like, yeah. I said I don't take an hour of your time, and it's already gone over that. I just quickly, if you don't have to rush off anywhere, I'd like to get to what's happening in America. Again, a country built on slavery and has a long history of racism. But there are people who argue, I guess, which has been the theme of today's conversation, that hey, that was then, this is now, and that police don't racially discriminate, and police don't what's the word I'm looking for, profile people based on their skin color, and yada yada yada. Two things. What do you think about the rioting and the violence that is occurring right now? Is some of that opportunist? And how do you have that conversation that even if there is opportunist crime, it doesn't take away from the very real need for this protest at the moment?
Yeah. One of the things I've found really amazing of the last week to 10 days has been how high profile the kōrero has been in New Zealand. And not just New Zealand, but globally, actually, from what I can see. And I think that comes from, because of course Black Lives Matter has been around for a number of years now, and obviously the wider, bigger picture issues of racial inequality and disparity in the United States that's been around obviously for decades. But I mean, ironically, and perhaps not surprisingly, the fact that all 50 states, there are protests in all 50 states, that has elevated this matter to a matter of global discourse. That's a good thing. The fact that it's come off the back of rioting, what do I think about rioting? It's almost inevitable, really. It shows the breakdown of the civics of a society. It does show a lack of disrespect in some senses, I suppose. But in my view, again, what I said about what I said right at the beginning about individual criminal behaviour. It's not, you don't excuse it, but you can certainly explain it. This is generations of frustration, of anger, of sadness, of, how can people be surprised by that? In many ways, I think I'm surprised that Maori aren't more violent. That's probably a terrible thing to say, but I am surprised that in the public sense. I think the very sad thing is that we take that anger
into
and
our
frustration
homes.
out upon ourselves. That our men take it out upon our women, our men and women take it out upon our children, and to some extent they break those ranks and harm others and the property of other people. But this very public face of violence, I completely understand it. Some of it is opportunist, yes. And I think one of the things that, again, is probably, I know is overplayed in the media is the extent of the violence. There is far more non-violent protest.
That's true. I saw a video of cops dancing with protesters today, and it made me go, fuck, not all cops are horrible pieces of shit. Like, having worked in sexual violence prevention and family violence, and fuck, I grew up with cops coming to take my father away and like keep my mom safe, like I will never be able to be on board with ACAB, all cops are bastards. Like, what do you think of that? Is that...
I might have to plead the fifth on that.
Oh shit. All right.
I'll tell you a story. I've being a mum is the greatest thing in my life, and I absolutely worship my children. But I must say, the day that my 15-year-old daughter, about 2 years ago, came home from a careers day at school and said, "I think I want to be a cop," and I nearly died.
Oh, really? That's really interesting.
You sure you don't want to be a hooker, or a drug dealer, or something more socially acceptable?
Socially acceptable. Yeah, totally. Okay, well, that's interesting. So you understand?
People, people are people, but they don't distract from. And of course, not all cops are bastards, but we can accept that policing as an institution is racist and corrupt. That's really almost beyond debate. And same thing, I'd have the same attitude in relation to Oranga Tamariki and numerous other branches and agencies of the state. They are broken, they are corrupt, and they need to be dismantled and fundamentally changed. Which is not to say I've worked for Crown agencies, right? I worked for universities, which are also racist and bigoted and perpetuate terrible things in the way that they offer education. But that doesn't mean that all the people in there are bad people, but they, and it's wrong, I think, to highlight, Mr. X is a good cop. Well, so what? That does, institution is still fundamentally requires changing. We did this in New Zealand, in terms of our journey along the sort of racial reconciliation journey, I suppose, is that we did that a generation ago. We did the what Moana Jackson and Juan Todi refer to as indigenization, browning the police force, browning the corrections officers, so, the idea of if you had more people that looked like you, then that would make a difference. It doesn't. It doesn't. Right. All the research shows, you ask a Māori person, if they see a Māori cop, what do they see? They see a cop. You're still a cop.
Yeah, that's
and it's not about, so how that is how you make that different is, it's not actually about, representation is important, don't get me wrong, whether you're talking about, the judiciary, lawyers, teachers, cops, anything. It is important to have institutions that reflect the demographics of our society, no doubt. But you also need to have those institutions reflect the values, the life outlook, the culture of those people. And a good example of that in recent years was in relation to policing, is the use of, so Māori cops is one thing, but in a Māori way. So, for example, the police have found that community-style policing is far more effective because it's built upon relationships. It doesn't matter if you're Māori, Pākehā, Asian. If you are a known quantity in the community, that is John or that is so-and-so. It's a person you have a relationship with. Therefore, you're going to be more effective at policing a Māori community.
So people actually identify with the individual rather than the institution of the police, who have got historical historically negative associations
Yeah.
with minority. Because this is interesting, man. I saw a photo
Absolutely.
I saw a photo on Instagram today of a white girl in America pulling the finger at an African American policeman, like standing in his face. And I was like, this is I don't know what to fucking make of it, because it's an anti-racist protest. And here's a white girl who's clearly of privilege, at least economically speaking, fucking doing the fingers to a black cop. I'm like, what do we make of that in this context? Do you know what Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's quite funny. I must say, so there were one of the great things about protests, and without, obviously minimising the importance of the core kaupapa, is signs. I fucking love a good protest sign. There were some great signs at the rally on Sunday. My favourite one, reference to all of those white college boys, probably of your age and mine, who grew up listening to Public Enemy and Ice-T and Body Count, and so listened to Fuck the Police, and that they weren't there, so they're still. So there was this dude had a sign that said, "Alexa, play Fuck the Police." So now you're an old, rich, middle-aged white guy, but you can listen in your lounge to.
Oh, I know. I found myself in my Audi, like rapping along to some gangster shit from when I was like it's an old Audi, but still, it's not lost on me that I'm now a middle-aged white guy. Nearly middle-aged. Yeah, it's a funny fucking one. I guess the thing is is to, as we advance through our positions in life, to understand where we come from. And in the hardcore scene, the musical scene I grew up in, we said don't forget your roots, and I guess as and you and people like us who might have come from one situation or not, you didn't, and moved into other stations in life, is to then advocate for those who come, like turn around and help people come and use your privilege, use your privilege or use your advantages that you may have to help those who are still in that same place. Or is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Part of the, again, that's part of the privilege, I suppose, of being in a position to do things, to do things differently, to have influence, and without, part of your balance is allowing people to, basically come to, change their own attitudes or behaviours, but you help them, illuminate what things could be different, I suppose.
Mm. Hey, Khylee, I've taken up far too much of your precious time, but look, I've really, really enjoyed speaking with you today. You're a fount of knowledge, and there are a million and one things I would love to continue unraveling and unpacking with you. So maybe we can do this again in the future. Hey, thank you for the hard work you put in every day into Aotearoa New Zealand to make it a better, kind of more equitable, harmonious place to live. I really want to acknowledge your mahi and the kaupapa that you do, and I hope to stay in connection with you.
Kia ora.
All right, choice. I'm just gonna stop recording.